Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think a lot of people are curious about, and that is the true cost of renewable energy.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic these days.
So obviously the cost of solar panels and wind turbines has come down a lot,
It has.
um, but we don't often hear about all the other costs involved in making sure that the lights stay on, 24/7.
Right. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, so we've got some really fascinating research that uses this new metric. It's called
LFSCOE.
levelized full system costs of electricity.
That's a mouthful.
It is mouthful. And
Uh,
so I think we're going to be saying LFSCOE a lot today.
hmm.
But basically, it looks at the cost of powering an entire region with just one energy source
And storage.
and storage. That's the key part, right?
Exactly.
Because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine.
Right. It's not like coal or natural gas.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
we've got to figure out how to store that energy for when we need it. So the research we're looking at today focuses on two really interesting places, uh, Germany and Texas.
Two very different energy landscapes for sure.
Yeah, Germany, of course, is known for its commitment to renewable energy. They've really been pushing hard to transition away from fossil fuels.
Absolutely. They've invested a lot in solar and wind.
And then Texas, on the other hand, is sort of wide open spaces, lots of sunshine, lots of wind.
Yeah, a lot of potential for renewables there.
Yeah, so you would think that maybe the cost of renewables would be lower in a place like Texas, but
Well, not necessarily. And that's what's so interesting about this research.
right.
They found that the LFSCOE for both wind and solar is actually much higher than for traditional sources like coal, natural gas, even nuclear.
Really? See, that's what I find so surprising because we always hear about how cheap renewables are becoming.
Yeah, and that's where the traditional metric that we've been using, which is called LCOE, that's levelized cost of electricity,
Right.
that only tells part of the story. It only looks at the cost of generating the electricity, not the cost of all the storage and infrastructure needed to make it reliable.
So, for example, in Germany, the LCOE of solar is only $36 per megawatt hour, which sounds pretty good.
It does, but when you factor in the cost of storage using the LFSCOE metric, it jumps to $1,548 per megawatt hour.
Wow. Okay. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's over 40 times higher.
So even though the solar panels themselves are getting cheaper, the cost of storing all that energy is still massive.
Right. And it's not just the cost of the batteries themselves, it's the sheer scale of storage you need.
You're talking about enormous amounts of batteries to
Exactly.
power an entire country when the sun's not shining.
Right.
Okay, so what about Texas? I mean, does all that sunshine make a difference?
It does. The LFSCOE for solar in Texas was lower, around $413 per megawatt hour. Still a significant jump from the LCOE, but, less than in Germany.
Okay, so location matters. Big surprise there.
Location matters a lot, yeah.
What about wind power? What does the LFSCOE look like for that?
Similar story, the LFSCOE for wind in Germany was $504 per megawatt hour compared to $291 in Texas.
Okay, so again, much higher than the LCOE.
Right, much higher.
So it seems like no matter where you are, renewables face this big hurdle when it comes to cost-effective storage.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something in this research that really blew my mind.
Oh, yeah.
They modeled a scenario where the cost of storage capacity dropped by 95%.
That's a lot.
Yeah, 95%. That's like some crazy futuristic technology.
Right, like super cheap batteries everywhere.
Exactly. So I was
Yeah.
really curious to see, did that solve the problem?
Well, in Germany, even with that drastic reduction, wind and solar still couldn't beat traditional energy sources in terms of LFSCOE.
Really? So even if we had those super batteries from the future, a fully renewable grid in Germany would still be incredibly expensive.
According to this research, yeah.
Wow. Okay, what about Texas, though?
Now, Texas is where things get a little more interesting. Okay. With that 95% drop in storage costs, wind and solar actually became more competitive. They even surpassed nuclear and biomass in terms of LFSCOE.
So Texas, with all that sun and wind, might actually have a shot at a truly renewable grid.
Potentially.
Yeah. But only if storage gets ridiculously cheap.
Right. It has to be a game changer in terms of storage technology.
Okay, so this is where my brain starts to hurt a little bit.
I hear you.
It seems like location and resource availability are key
Absolutely.
when we're talking about the viability of a renewable powered grid.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. But I have to admit, when I first heard about this whole LFSCOE thing, I thought, who's actually going to build a grid that runs on just one type of energy?
Yeah, it's a pretty extreme scenario.
Seemed a little extreme.
Yeah, and the researchers thought about that too.
Okay.
They actually introduced a modified version of the metric called LFSCOE 95.
LFSCOE 95.
Oh,
We're going to
wow.
have to unpack that when we come back.
We'll dive into that after the break.
Sounds good. All right, so LFSCOE 95. What's the 95 all about?
So it's like this, you know how you were saying that a grid that only uses one energy source seems a little crazy?
Yeah, a little unrealistic.
So LFSCOE 95 basically says, okay, what if 95% of your electricity comes from one source, like solar or wind, but you've got a 5% backup from something else just in case?
Ah, okay, so it's like a safety net for those times when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing.
Exactly, yeah. Just a little bit of insurance.
Did that change the cost much?
Oh, yeah, big time. The LFSCOE 95 was like half the cost of the original LFSCOE for both wind and solar.
Wow, really? So having that little bit of backup makes a huge difference.
It really does. You don't need as much storage, you're only covering those really extreme situations.
So does that mean that maybe a mixed energy system is the way to go for now?
I think it's a pretty strong argument for having a mix of different sources, to make sure you've got reliability and manage costs.
It's like a diversified investment portfolio.
Exactly. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Okay, so we've got LCOE, LF, SICO, LF SICOE 95. My head's spinning.
Yeah, it's a lot of acronyms, I know.
But the main takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Absolutely. Different places have different needs, different resources.
Speaking of costs, there was something else in this research that I thought was really interesting.
Oh, yeah?
They found that even if you lose some energy in the process of storing it, it doesn't have a huge impact on the overall cost.
Yeah, that sounds counterintuitive.
It does. Why is that?
Well, it's because when you have a system that's heavily reliant on wind and solar, you often end up generating more electricity than you need at certain times.
So you say there's like an overproduction of energy sometimes.
Right, and some of that energy might get lost in the process of storing it and getting it back out again.
But it's not a big deal because you're going to have that extra energy anyway.
Exactly. It's kind of like if you have a garden and you have way more tomatoes than you can eat.
Right. Some of them are going to go bad, but they were free anyway.
Exactly. So it's a similar concept with the energy.
Okay, so that makes sense. But why does all this matter? I mean, what are the real-world implications of this research?
Well, for one thing, it has big implications for energy policy. Governments are making decisions about where to invest billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And if we want to transition to a cleaner energy future, we need to be realistic about the costs.
So it's not as simple as just saying, let's go 100% renewable.
No, it's more complicated than that.
There are trade-offs to consider.
Absolutely.
What might work in Texas might not work in Germany.
Right. Each place has to figure out its own path.
And then we also have to consider the fact that energy demand is changing.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge factor.
With electric cars and smart homes and everything.
It's a whole new ballgame.
So what does all this tell us about the best way to transition to a cleaner energy future?
Well, I think this research really highlights the importance of a diversified approach. Investing in renewables is definitely crucial, but we also have to recognize the value of other sources like nuclear and even natural gas, especially during this transition period.
So it's not an either-or situation.
No, it's about finding the right mix.